The tattooed guy at the laundromat saved me a seat every week. Gay love story. Why would someone quietly save the same seat every single week? Could such a simple gesture mean more than it first appears? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. If you enjoy heartfelt stories filled with emotion, meaningful connections, and unforgettable journeys, you are in the right place. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Your support truly helps us continue sharing inspiring stories like this one. Thank you so much for watching, for your kindness, and for being part of this amazing community. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, have you ever experienced a small act of kindness that stayed with you for years? Now, settle in, relax, and let this unforgettable story begin. The strangest love stories never begin with a kiss. Sometimes, they begin with an empty chair that nobody else is allowed to take. Every Thursday at exactly 7:15 p.m., I walked through the glass doors of Maple Street Laundromat carrying the same blue canvas laundry bag that had started to fade around the handles after years of use. The place smelled like warm cotton, fresh detergent, and coffee drifting over from the small cafe next door. The dryers hummed like quiet background music while old ceiling fans lazily pushed cool air across the room, and somehow everything about that little laundromat made the rest of the city feel slower. There was one thing that never changed. No matter how busy it was, no matter how many people filled every machine, one chair always remained empty. It sat beside a tall guy with tattooed arms who spent his waiting time sketching designs inside a weathered notebook. Nobody ever asked if the seat was available. Nobody ever tried to take it. They simply looked at him once, then found another place to sit. The first time I noticed it, I assumed it was coincidence. The second time, I wondered if he was expecting someone. By the fourth Thursday, curiosity had become part of my weekly routine. Then one rainy evening, every other chair was taken. I hesitated with my laundry basket balanced against my hip, ready to lean against the wall for the next 40 minutes. Before I could decide, the tattooed guy looked up from his notebook, smiled like we'd already met somewhere, and lightly tapped the empty chair beside him. "It's open," he said. His voice was calm, easygoing, the kind that made awkward situations disappear before they had a chance to exist. "Thanks," I answered, lowering myself into the seat while trying not to wonder why nobody else had claimed it first. "I'm Mason." "Ethan." That was it. No dramatic introduction. No instant connection. We simply watched our washing machine spin in comfortable silence until he asked what I did for work. "I'm a freelance illustrator," I told him. "Mostly children's books and greeting cards." He grinned. "Guess we're both drawing for a living." I glanced toward the notebook resting on his knee. "Tattoo artist." He nodded. "Been working at Black Pine Tattoo Studio for almost 6 years." We spent the rest of that evening talking about favorite coffee shops, bad apartment plumbing, impossible parking downtown, and why laundromat somehow attracted the nicest people. When my dryer buzzed 45 minutes later, we wished each other a good night and went home. It should have ended there. Instead, the following Thursday, I walked inside and found the same chair waiting beside him. "You're late," Mason joked, checking an imaginary watch. "Traffic," I laughed, even though I'd actually spent 10 extra minutes deciding whether showing up again would seem strange. From then on, Thursday nights quietly became ours. We never planned them. We never exchanged phone numbers. We never made promises. Somehow, we always arrived within minutes of each other. If I got there first, I started the washers and looked toward the entrance without admitting I was waiting. If Mason arrived first, that chair stayed empty until I walked through the door. Week after week, seasons slowly changed outside the windows. Autumn leaves became Christmas decorations. Winter storms became spring rain. Summer sunlight stretched later into the evening. The chair never disappeared. Neither did he. Sometimes we'd split a blueberry muffin from the cafe. Sometimes we'd debate whether old movies were better than new ones. Sometimes we'd sit for nearly an hour saying almost nothing at all, listening to dryers tumble while people came and went around us. I learned he volunteered every other Saturday teaching free art classes to teenagers. He learned my dream was to someday illustrate my own children's novel instead of someone else's words. He teased me for always folding towels first. I teased him because every hoodie he owned somehow had tiny ink stains on the sleeves. Somewhere between ordinary Thursdays and quiet conversations, I stopped looking forward to weekends as much as I looked forward to laundry night. That realization scared me more than I wanted to admit, because Mason wasn't just becoming my favorite part of the week. He was becoming the place where my mind rested after every difficult day. And I knew something else, something I refused to say out loud even to myself. People don't usually save the same seat for someone unless that seat already means something. The only question was whether it meant the same thing to both of us. The weeks quietly slipped into months until Thursday evenings became so predictable that I could almost tell the time without checking my phone. Around 7 o'clock I would finish the last illustration of the day, rinse my coffee mug, throw another load of clothes into my faded blue laundry bag, and start the 15-minute walk to Maple Street laundromat. No matter how stressful the week had been, the moment I pushed open those familiar glass doors and heard the comforting rhythm of spinning washers, I felt my shoulders relax. More often than not, Mason was already there. Sometimes he sat sketching roses, wolves, or mountain landscapes for future tattoo clients. Other times he simply leaned back with a paperback novel balanced on one knee while an untouched cup of coffee slowly cooled beside him. Without saying a word, he always looked up when I arrived and gave that same easy smile that somehow made the entire room feel brighter. The chair beside him remained empty until I sat down, as though everyone had silently accepted that it belonged to me. I never questioned it aloud. Some things felt too delicate to examine too closely. Our conversations grew longer without becoming heavier. We talked about ordinary things that somehow never felt ordinary. Mason told me stories about nervous customers getting their very first tattoos and how they almost always thanked him afterward for making the experience less frightening than they had imagined. I shared ridiculous publishing deadlines, impossible client revisions, and the strange challenge of drawing the same smiling squirrel 6 different ways because an editor insisted each expression carried a different emotional message. He laughed harder than anyone should have at that story. I realized I liked making him laugh more than I liked hearing my own jokes. One Thursday I noticed he arrived looking exhausted, dark circles under his eyes making him seem older than 28. He admitted his father had recently been diagnosed with a heart condition that required frequent medical appointments. The news worried him more than he wanted to admit because his father refused to ask anyone for help, insisting he was still perfectly capable of taking care of himself. I listened more than I spoke that evening. Before leaving, I quietly handed Mason one of the blueberry muffins we usually shared. I had bought 2 without thinking. He looked at it for a second before smiling softly. "You remembered. You skipped dinner," I replied. Someone had to notice. He thanked me in a voice so genuine that I carried that moment home with me for days. The following week he surprised me with a small sketchbook. The cover was plain brown leather, the pages thick enough for watercolor. "Your old one was almost full," he said casually. I stared at it longer than necessary because I had never mentioned needing another sketchbook. He had simply paid attention. That frightened me in ways I could not explain. Caring about someone from a safe distance was one thing. Being cared for in return felt far more dangerous because it invited hope, and hope had a habit of rewriting friendships into something neither person was prepared to name. I reminded myself constantly that Mason had never given me any reason to believe our connection was anything beyond friendship. He mentioned old girlfriends from college now and then. He smiled politely whenever women at the cafe flirted with him while picking up coffee before work. He never encouraged those conversations, but he never rejected them either. I convinced myself that was all the answer I needed. My feelings belonged to me alone, and if keeping them hidden meant I could spend every Thursday sitting beside him, then silence felt like a fair trade. One rainy evening, as we waited for our dryers to finish, an elderly woman struggled to carry an overflowing laundry basket toward the folding tables. Before I could stand, Mason was already helping her without hesitation, carefully setting the basket down before returning to his seat as though he had done nothing remarkable. "You do that a lot," I said. He looked confused. "Do what?" "Notice people." He shrugged with a quiet smile. Everyone wants to feel like somebody noticed they were having a hard day. His answer stayed with me long after we walked into the parking lot together beneath one oversized umbrella he insisted we share. As we reached the corner where our paths separated, he waved goodnight exactly as he always did. I watched him disappear into the light drizzle, unaware that I had begun measuring entire weeks by those few ordinary moments, never realizing how quickly something so simple could become the most important routine in my life. By the time October arrived, it felt impossible to remember what Thursdays had been like before Mason quietly became part of them. We still never texted because we had never exchanged phone numbers. We still never made plans because somehow we never needed to. The routine simply continued as though the city itself had decided that every Thursday evening we belonged in the same laundromat, sitting in the same two chairs while our clothes tumbled behind the glass doors of identical dryers. Then one Thursday, Mason did not show up. I glanced at the entrance every few minutes, pretending I was only watching the rain outside. 7:15 became 7:30. 7:30 became 8. The empty chair beside me remained empty for the first time in nearly 2 years. I told myself not to overthink it. People got busy. Life happened. Still, the walk home felt strangely longer than usual. The following Thursday, just as I was beginning to wonder whether our quiet tradition had ended without either of us saying goodbye, the familiar bell above the laundromat door rang. Mason stepped inside wearing a grey hoodie instead of his usual denim jacket, his smile smaller than normal but genuine enough to make my chest loosen with relief. "I owe you an explanation," he said as he placed his laundry bag on the floor beside the chair. "You do not owe me anything," I answered, trying to sound more casual than I felt. He let out a slow breath. "My father ended up in the hospital for a few days. He is home now, but everything has been complicated." We started our washing machines before settling into our usual seats. For several minutes neither of us spoke. Finally Mason rubbed the back of his neck, something he always did when searching for the right words. "There is another problem." I turned toward him. "What happened?" He looked embarrassed, which was unusual for someone who normally carried himself with quiet confidence. "Dad has been dealing with insurance paperwork, rehabilitation forms, and medical decisions. Yesterday someone at the hospital asked if he wanted his spouse or next of kin listed for future authorization. He joked that I should hurry up and get married so somebody could help with all of this someday." He forced a laugh that faded almost immediately. It sounds ridiculous, but it made me realize how many things become complicated when you are alone. I nodded, unsure where the conversation was leading. "My aunt heard the story," he continued. "Now she has convinced herself that I have been secretly dating someone for months because apparently I smile too much whenever she asks about my Thursdays." I could not help laughing. "What did you tell her?" "That she watches too many romantic movies." He smiled, but only for a moment. Unfortunately, she did not believe me. We both laughed, and for a second the conversation felt light again. Then Mason reached into his backpack and pulled out a thick envelope covered in official county markings. "This arrived today." I looked down at the documents without touching them. "What is it?" A friend from the shop recommended a temporary legal arrangement that would make some family paperwork easier while my father recovers. It started as a joke, but after talking to a lawyer, it turns out there is a perfectly legal process. My heartbeat quietly accelerated. Mason looked almost uncomfortable as he continued. "A civil marriage." I stared at him, convinced I had misunderstood. "Wait, what?" He raised both hands immediately. "Hear me out before you panic." I blinked several times while trying to process the words. "I am listening." The lawyer explained that it could simplify several family documents for a limited period, especially while helping Dad with medical decisions and housing paperwork. "It is not about pretending to fool anyone." It is just paperwork that can later be dissolved once everything settles down. He laughed nervously. The problem is that I trust exactly one person enough to ask something this strange. My mouth suddenly felt dry. The room around us faded beneath the soft hum of washing machines. Mason. He quickly interrupted. You can absolutely say no. Honestly, you probably should. I already feel terrible for even asking. He looked away before adding quietly, I just could not imagine asking anyone else. For several long seconds neither of us spoke. Outside, rain tapped gently against the laundromat windows while someone folded towels across the room. The ordinary sounds of Thursday continued exactly as they always had, yet somehow everything had changed. I looked at the unopened envelope resting between us, then at the chair that Mason had saved for me every single week without ever asking for anything in return. Somewhere deep inside me, I realized this simple, impossible question was about to change both of our lives, even if neither of us could yet imagine how far that change would reach. I did not answer that night. Instead, I asked Mason if I could take the envelope home and read through everything before making a decision. He nodded immediately, almost looking relieved that I had not walked away. Take all the time you need, he said. I meant what I said. If this makes you uncomfortable, we forget I ever asked. I carried the documents home tucked safely inside my backpack, but I barely looked at them until after midnight. Every page was exactly what Mason had described. There were legal explanations, timelines, and instructions about a simple civil marriage that could later be dissolved if both parties agreed. Nothing about it was romantic. Nothing about it resembled the promises people imagined when they thought about marriage. It was practical, temporary, and strangely ordinary on paper. Yet I could not stop staring at one blank line waiting for two signatures. I kept wondering how something that looked so official could feel so personal. The next morning I called the lawyer whose business card had been clipped to the front page. She patiently explained every detail, answered every question, and made it clear that nobody expected either of us to pretend to be something we were not. It was simply an arrangement that could simplify certain legal matters while Mason helped care for his father during recovery. When the conversation ended, I sat quietly beside my apartment window watching people hurry through the chilly October morning. Every logical reason told me this was a terrible idea. Every emotional reason reminded me that I trusted Mason more than anyone else in my life. By Thursday evening, I had reached a decision. Mason was already waiting in our usual seats when I arrived, but for the first time since we had met, he looked genuinely nervous. He stood as soon as he saw me. Whatever your answer is, we are still friends, he said before I even sat down. I smiled faintly. You practiced saying that, did not you? He laughed. Maybe once or twice. I placed the envelope on the chair between us. I read everything. His expression became unreadable. And? I took a slow breath. If this really helps your father and makes life a little easier for your family, then yes. He blinked as though he had expected the opposite answer. Really? Really? For several seconds he simply stared at me before letting out a long breath that sounded as though he had been holding it for days. Thank you, he said quietly. I know this is asking more than anyone should ask of a friend. I answered honestly. You have never treated me like just anyone. His smile returned, softer than usual, and somehow that made the decision feel less frightening. 2 weeks later we stood inside the county courthouse on an unusually bright Tuesday morning. The ceremony lasted less than 10 minutes. A clerk asked us a few routine questions, verified our identification, and invited us to sign the paperwork. There were no guests except Mason's elderly aunt, who dabbed happy tears from her eyes while insisting she had known all along that Thursday evenings meant something important. Mason and I exchanged an awkward glance that quickly turned into shared laughter. When the clerk handed each of us a simple silver wedding band included with the civil package, we both hesitated for exactly the same second before slipping them onto our fingers. The rings were plain, lightweight, and almost surprisingly ordinary, yet the cool metal resting against my hand felt impossible to ignore. Congratulations, the clerk said warmly. You are officially married. The words echoed inside my head in a way I had not expected. Married. Even knowing the arrangement was temporary, hearing it spoken aloud made my heart stumble. Outside the courthouse, Mason rubbed the back of his neck again. Well, he said with an embarrassed smile, that was probably the least romantic wedding in history. I laughed despite myself. At least we did not trip over anything. Give us time, he replied. We have only been married for about 30 seconds. We walked to a nearby coffee shop because neither of us knew what people were supposed to do after accidentally becoming husbands through paperwork. We ordered our usual drinks, found a quiet table by the window, and talked about everything except the wedding itself. It felt easier that way. Yet little things had already begun to change. When the barista called out our order, she smiled brightly and said, "Your drinks are ready, gentlemen." Then she looked at the matching rings on our hands. "You two make a lovely couple." Neither of us corrected her. Mason simply picked up both cups before handing one to me with the same familiar smile he had worn every Thursday for nearly 2 years. Somehow everything felt exactly the same as before, and at the very same moment, nothing felt the same at all. Life had a remarkable way of pretending nothing had changed even after everything had. The following Thursday, Mason and I returned to Maple Street Laundromat carrying the same laundry bags, choosing the same machines, and settling into the same familiar chairs. The only visible difference was the simple silver bands resting on our left hands. I caught myself turning mine inward whenever strangers walked past, not because I regretted saying yes, but because wearing it made the arrangement feel surprisingly real. Mason noticed the gesture almost immediately. "You can take it off if it makes you uncomfortable," he said gently while pouring detergent into his washer. I shook my head. I agree to this. I am not going to make you explain why your husband suddenly stopped wearing a wedding ring. He smiled with quiet appreciation. Thank you. That simple exchange somehow carried more emotion than either of us intended. The weeks that followed settled into a new rhythm. We still spent Thursday evenings together, but now there were small responsibilities woven into our friendship. I accompanied Mason to visit his father a few times because the older man insisted on meeting the person who had unexpectedly become part of the family. Richard Carter welcomed me with a warm handshake and an easy smile that looked almost identical to Mason's. He thanked me for helping during a difficult season without asking uncomfortable questions or treating our arrangement like something unusual. We played cards together, watched old baseball games on television, and listened to Richard tell stories about teaching Mason how to ride a bicycle when he was 6 years old. I found myself laughing more than I expected. Those afternoons felt less like fulfilling an obligation and more like quietly becoming part of a family I had never imagined could include me. Mason's aunt was even more enthusiastic. She mailed handwritten holiday recipes to my apartment, insisted I call her Aunt Linda after only 2 visits, and never once doubted that Mason and I belonged together. Every time she spoke about our future with cheerful certainty, guilt tugged gently at my heart because I knew our marriage had an expiration date, even if she did not. One chilly Saturday afternoon, Mason invited me to his tattoo studio after closing hours because he wanted my opinion on a mural he had been painting across one interior wall. While he added careful brushstrokes to a mountain landscape, I sat on a stool sketching ideas for a children's book character. We worked in comfortable silence until someone knocked on the unlocked front door. A young woman stepped inside carrying a paper bag from the bakery across the street. "I figured you forgot lunch again," she said with an amused smile. Mason laughed. "Claire, you know me too well." He introduced us without hesitation. "Ethan, this is Claire. We went to art school together." She offered a friendly handshake before placing fresh sandwiches on the counter. "It is nice to finally meet you. Mason talks about your illustrations all the time." I smiled politely, but something about the ease between them quietly unsettled me. They finished each other's jokes, remembered stories from years before I knew him, and laughed with the relaxed familiarity of old friends. There was nothing inappropriate about it. Nothing that suggested romance. Still, an uncomfortable thought slipped into my mind before I could stop it. Claire belonged to the chapter of Mason's life that existed long before I arrived. She understood pieces of him that I never would. As they discussed former classmates and professors, I suddenly felt like an unexpected guest inside someone else's memories. Mason noticed I had grown unusually quiet during the walk home. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Just tired," I answered too quickly. He accepted the explanation without pressing further, but I could tell he was not entirely convinced. Over the next several days I found myself creating small distances that only I seemed to notice. I stayed later at work instead of visiting the studio. I politely declined coffee after laundry one Thursday by claiming I had a deadline. I even arrived at the laundromat a little later than usual, hoping to convince myself that our routine did not matter as much as it actually did. Each time, Mason welcomed me with the same patient smile, never complaining, never asking why something felt different. That only made the guilt heavier. I reminded myself over and over that this marriage had always been temporary. Sooner or later the paperwork would end, the rings would come off, and Mason would continue living the life he had always planned. If someone like Claire eventually became part of that future, I had no right to stand in the way. The safest thing I could do was begin stepping back before my heart forgot that this beautiful, ordinary life had never truly belonged to me in the first place. Winter arrived quietly, wrapping the city in crisp mornings and early sunsets that painted the streets in shades of amber long before dinner. My schedule became busier as publishers rushed to finish projects before the holidays, and I accepted every assignment that came my way. Part of me appreciated the extra work. The other part knew I was using it as an excuse to avoid thinking too much. Mason never complained about the growing distance between us, but I noticed the way he looked toward the laundromat door every Thursday until I finally walked inside. Even when I arrived 20 minutes late, the chair beside him remained empty, untouched, waiting exactly where it always had. He still greeted me with the same easy smile, still asked about my latest illustrations, and still remembered to bring an extra blueberry muffin whenever he stopped by the cafe first. His kindness never changed. Only my ability to enjoy it without guilt did. A few days before Christmas, my landlord announced that the building would undergo major plumbing repairs after the new year. Every tenant had to relocate for at least a month. I found a small furnished apartment across town that was available immediately, and although the move was temporary, it felt like another quiet reminder that nothing in life stayed exactly the same forever. I decided to pack over the weekend while finishing my last illustration deadline. Saturday morning arrived with light snow drifting outside my windows. Cardboard boxes covered the living room floor as I sorted books, sketch supplies, and years of little souvenirs that most people would have considered meaningless. Around noon someone knocked gently on my apartment door. I opened it to find Mason standing there holding 2 cups of hot chocolate and wearing the same grey hoodie that had become his unofficial weekend uniform. "I figured you should not have to move alone," he said with a grin. "Besides, I owe you for helping my father all those weekends." I laughed and stepped aside. "Come in." We spent the next several hours packing shelves, wrapping dishes in newspaper, and carrying sealed boxes down 3 flights of stairs. Working together felt wonderfully familiar, almost like those quiet Thursdays had simply followed us home. Mason joked about my impossible collection of sketch pencils while I teased him for labeling every box in oversized block letters as though the movers might be grading his handwriting. We laughed often, and for the first time in weeks the uncomfortable distance between us seemed to soften. Late that afternoon I carried an old storage box from the back of my bedroom closet. The cardboard had begun to bend with age, and before I reached the living room the bottom gave way. The contents spilled across the hardwood floor in a soft cascade of paper. Hundreds of faded laundromat receipts scattered in every direction alongside old Polaroid photographs, ticket stubs, folded notes, and a small wooden keepsake box. I froze. My heartbeat seemed to stop. "Ethan, I have got them," Mason said automatically as he knelt to help gather everything. "Wait." The word escaped my mouth too late. He had already picked up one of the tiny laundry receipts. I watched his eyes move across the back of the paper where neat handwriting filled every available inch. "Thursday." He smiled at the joke Ethan made about squirrels today. Thursday. He looked exhausted but still saved my seat. Thursday. He remembered that I like blueberry muffins without asking. Mason. Frowned slightly before reaching for another receipt. Then another. Every single one carried another short entry beginning with the same day of the week. They were never dramatic declarations. They were tiny memories, moments I had been too afraid to lose. A sketch of the chair beside him. A note about the first time he laughed so hard that coffee nearly spilled across the folding table. A reminder that his father was feeling stronger after surgery. A sentence describing how safe the laundromat felt whenever he was there. Years of ordinary Thursdays preserved on scraps of paper I had never intended anyone else to read. Ethan. Mason whispered. I quickly gathered several receipts into shaking hands, desperate to hide them before he could continue. They are nothing. He looked at me with quiet confusion rather than judgment. Nothing? His voice was almost inaudible. You kept every receipt. Neither of us moved. Snow continued falling outside while the apartment settled into complete silence. The spilled memories lay scattered between us like pieces of a story neither one of us had fully understood until that moment. Mason slowly picked up the small wooden keepsake box that had rolled beneath the coffee table. It had not opened during the fall, but he turned it over curiously in his hands before looking back at me. What is inside? He asked gently. I felt my breath catch because I knew exactly what rested beneath the little brass latch, and for the first time since we had met, I was no longer certain whether I could keep the truth hidden much longer. My hands trembled as I reached for the small wooden box, but Mason did not pull it away. He simply held it carefully, as though he already understood that whatever rested inside mattered more than the box itself. For several long seconds neither of us spoke. The apartment had grown so quiet that I could hear the old radiator clicking softly against the winter air outside. Finally I forced a nervous smile that disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. It is embarrassing, I admitted. Mason looked at me with the same patient expression he always wore whenever he believed someone needed time instead of pressure. You do not have to show me if you do not want to. I looked down at the scattered laundry receipts surrounding us like tiny pages torn from a diary. Keeping the truth hidden suddenly felt impossible. I slowly took the box from his hands and lifted the small brass latch. Inside were several neatly stacked memory cards, an old digital voice recorder no bigger than my palm, and a folded photograph from nearly 2 years earlier. Mason picked up the photograph first. It showed the laundromat on a rainy evening. The image was slightly blurry because it had clearly been taken through the front window of the cafe next door. In the corner of the picture, he was sitting in his usual chair, sketchbook resting on his knee. The chair beside him was empty. You took this? He asked quietly. I nodded. The week before I finally sat down beside you. He turned the photograph over. On the back I had written a single sentence. I wonder who that empty chair is waiting for. Mason read the words twice before carefully placing the picture back into the box. His attention shifted to the little voice recorder. What is on this? I closed my eyes for a brief moment. Things I never had the courage to say. He looked at me as though asking permission without speaking. I gave the smallest nod. Mason pressed the play button. At first there was only silence followed by my own nervous laughter recorded months earlier. Then my voice filled the room, hesitant and uncertain. Hello, Mason. I know you will never hear this because I am definitely deleting it. I just needed to practice saying thank you for always saving me a seat. The recording ended after only a few seconds. Mason looked surprised. He pressed the next file. Hi, Mason. I almost told you today that Thursdays became my favorite day because of you, but that sounded strange, so I did not. Click. Another recording. I think your father is lucky to have you. I wish you could see yourself the way everyone else does. Click. Another. You smiled when you handed me that sketchbook today. I wanted to tell you it was the nicest gift anyone has ever given me. Click. Another. None of the recordings contained a confession. None of them used the word love. They were simply dozens of moments where I had tried to put ordinary feelings into ordinary words before losing my nerve and saving them instead of speaking them. Mason listened without interrupting. One recording after another. One Thursday after another. Nearly 2 years preserved inside a handful of unfinished conversations. When the final message ended, neither of us moved. I stared at the floor because I could not bear to watch his reaction. "I was never supposed to hear these," he said softly. "No." My voice barely rose above a whisper. "They were only for me." Another silence settled between us, heavier than any we had ever shared inside the laundromat. Finally I gathered enough courage to speak the truth that had followed me for years. "I never expected anything from you. I never wanted to change our friendship or make your life complicated. Writing things down and recording those messages was the only way I knew how to let the feelings exist without asking you to carry them too." I laughed quietly at myself, though nothing felt amusing. Then somehow we ended up married because of paperwork, and I convinced myself I could keep pretending nothing had changed. Mason remained completely still. His eyes wandered across the scattered receipts once more before settling on the silver wedding band resting on his hand. He slowly turned the ring with his thumb as though noticing its weight for the very first time. "Ethan," he said after what felt like forever, "I have spent months wondering why it bothered me every time you pulled away, why Thursdays felt wrong whenever you arrived late, and why the idea of this marriage ending suddenly feels different than it did before." He stopped himself before finishing the thought, almost startled by his own words. Neither of us had answers yet. We only had an unopened future standing quietly between us, waiting with the same patient certainty as an empty chair that had never really been empty at all. The days after that afternoon felt strangely quiet, not because Mason disappeared, but because neither of us knew how to step forward without changing everything. We still met on Thursday evening. We still loaded our washing machines, folded our clothes, and shared coffee from the cafe next door. The conversations were gentle, familiar, almost identical to the hundreds we had shared before, yet beneath every ordinary sentence lingered the memory of those handwritten receipts and unfinished voice messages. Every now and then I caught Mason looking at me as though he had discovered a page of a book he had somehow skipped the first time. He never made me explain anything again. Instead, he paid even closer attention to the smallest moments, and somehow that made my heart ache more than any difficult conversation could have. One Thursday evening he arrived carrying a folded legal envelope instead of his sketchbook. He placed it carefully on the empty chair between us before either of us sat down. I recognized the county seal immediately. "The lawyer called," he said quietly. "Everything with my father is finally settled. His recovery has gone better than anyone expected." I smiled with genuine relief. "That is wonderful news." He nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful. "She also said the paperwork for ending our marriage is ready whenever we are." My chest tightened despite every promise I had made to myself. This had always been the plan. Temporary. Practical. Simple. I forced a small smile. "Then we should probably schedule it." Mason did not answer right away. Instead, he watched the washing machines begin their familiar slow rotation behind the glass doors. "Probably," he said at last, although the word sounded uncertain. The following Tuesday we were supposed to meet at the lawyer's office shortly after 10 o'clock in the morning. I arrived 15 minutes early with the silver wedding band tucked inside my jacket pocket because I could not bring myself to wear it there. The receptionist smiled politely and offered me coffee while I waited. 10 o'clock came and went. Then 10:15. Then 10:30. I checked my phone more times than I cared to admit, but there were no messages. Finally the lawyer stepped into the waiting room with an apologetic expression. "I am sorry," she said gently. "It looks like Mr. Carter called earlier this morning. He cancelled today's appointment." I blinked in surprise. "Cancelled?" She nodded. "He said he was not ready to sign." My thoughts became a blur before I thanked her and stepped outside into the cold winter air. Snow had begun falling again, covering sidewalks and parked cars in a thin white blanket. I stood there for several minutes, completely unsure what I was supposed to do next. Then my phone rang for the first time since Mason and I had known each other. We had finally exchanged numbers after the courthouse, yet we had rarely used them. His name appeared on the screen. "Where are you?" he asked quietly after I answered. "Outside the lawyer's office." There was a long pause before he spoke again. "Can you come to the laundromat?" I looked at my watch. It was barely 11 in the morning. We had never been there together on any day except Thursday. "Now?" I asked. "Please." I did not ask another question. 20 minutes later I pushed open the familiar glass doors. The room was almost empty because most people were at work. The dryers hummed softly in the background while pale winter sunlight filtered through the front windows. Mason was already there, sitting in his usual chair. The one beside him remained empty exactly as it always had. He looked up the moment I entered. For a second neither of us spoke. Then he stood and gently rested one hand on the back of the empty chair. "I almost signed the papers this morning," he admitted. "I even carried the ring in my pocket because I thought it would make saying goodbye easier." He looked down at the chair before meeting my eyes again. Then I realized something on the drive over. Every Thursday for nearly 2 years before we were married, I saved this seat without thinking about it. After we got married, I kept saving it even on the days you were late because I could not imagine anyone else sitting here. Somewhere along the way it stopped being a habit and became the place where I always expected you to be. I kept telling myself that was friendship, but friendships are not usually the first thing you think about every morning or the one thing that makes an ordinary room feel complete. He reached into his coat pocket, slowly pulled out the silver wedding band, and held it gently in his palm. "I cancelled today because I finally understood that I was not afraid of ending paperwork. I was afraid of losing the life we accidentally built together, and I do not think that fear came from friendship alone." For a long moment I could not find a single word. The familiar sounds of washers turning and dryers humming filled the silence between us, just as they had every Thursday since the beginning. Nothing about the laundromat had changed. The same rows of machines stood against the walls. The same faded tile floor reflected the soft winter sunlight. The same empty chair waited beside Mason. Yet somehow it felt like the entire world had quietly shifted. I looked at the wedding band resting in his hand before meeting his eyes again. "Mason," I whispered, "you do not have to say anything because of what you found at my apartment." He slowly shook his head. "I am not here because of the receipts." Another small shake of his head. "I am not here because of the recordings either." He smiled gently, almost laughing at himself. "Those things only helped me understand something that had already been happening for a very long time." He rested both hands on the back of the empty chair and looked around the room. "Do you remember the first rainy night you walked in here and every seat was taken?" I nodded. "I had noticed you weeks before that," he admitted. "You always came in alone. You always looked exhausted, but somehow you still smiled politely at everyone. One Thursday somebody sat beside me before you arrived, and I remember feeling disappointed. I could not explain why. The next week I decided I would keep the chair open just in case." He laughed softly. "I told myself it was only because you seemed nice." Then another Thursday passed, and another one after that. Before I realized it, saving that seat had become the most natural part of my week. My eyes stung with unexpected tears as he continued. "When my aunt started teasing me about spending every Thursday with the same person, I honestly believed she was imagining things. I kept insisting we were only friends because that was the only explanation that made sense to me." He looked down at the silver ring once more. "Then we got married because life became complicated, and somehow everything became simpler instead. Coffee tasted better because you were there. Visiting my father felt easier because you were beside me. Even grocery shopping stopped feeling like another chore when we did it together after laundry." He smiled with quiet disbelief. "I kept thinking those feelings belonged inside friendship until you started pulling away. That was when I realized I was afraid, not of losing a friend, but of losing the person who had quietly become my home. I felt every carefully built wall inside me begin to disappear. I never wanted to ask you to change, I said honestly. That was why I stayed silent. I loved what we already had too much to risk losing it. Mason stepped closer until only the empty chair remained between us. Then let me be the one who changes, he answered. Not because anyone asked me to. Because I finally understand my own heart. He reached toward the chair, lifted it slightly, and moved it out of the way. It was such a small gesture, almost ordinary, yet it carried the weight of every Thursday we had ever shared. Standing directly in front of me now, he slipped the silver wedding band back onto his finger before looking at me with the same calm smile that had welcomed me on countless evenings. I do not want to keep saving a chair for you anymore, he said quietly. I want to save a place for you in every ordinary day that comes after this one. I could not stop smiling. Are you absolutely sure? He nodded without hesitation. For the first time in my life. I took my own ring from my coat pocket and slid it back onto my hand. Neither of us rushed the moment. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic music, no perfect movie ending. Mason simply reached for my hand, and I let him. Outside, snow continued falling over the quiet streets while inside the dryers completed another cycle with their familiar gentle chime. A few months later we visited the courthouse once again, not to sign papers ending our marriage, but to update the temporary documents into the life we had freely chosen together. Richard smiled wider than either of us had ever seen, Aunt Linda cried exactly as everyone expected, and the courthouse clerk laughed when she recognized us. Thursday evenings never disappeared. We still carried laundry bags into the same little laundromat, still ordered blueberry muffins from the cafe next door, and still smiled whenever we saw the two familiar chairs waiting by the window. The only difference was that neither chair was ever left empty anymore, because after all that time we had finally learned that the smallest acts of kindness can quietly become the strongest promises, and sometimes the place where someone saves you a seat is the very place where you discover you have been finding your way home all along.